The sun was setting over the city skyline as Judge Kimberly Washington gathered her belongings from her chambers. The weight of the day's cases still lingered in her mind. She presided over 3 significant hearings, including a complex custody battle that had touched her heart. After 15 years on the bench, she'd learned to carry these emotional burdens with grace, but some days still tested her resolve. She smiled warmly at the courthouse security guard as she walked through the marble hallway, her heels echoing against the floor. "Another late evening, Judge," he called out with genuine concern. "Someone's got to keep justice moving," she replied with a gentle laugh, adjusting her pearl necklace, a graduation gift from her grandmother who'd always dreamed of seeing a lawyer in the family. The parking garage was quiet at this hour, just the way she liked it. Her black Mercedes, though expensive, wasn't about showing off. It was about rewarding herself for decades of hard work, from the sleepless nights in law school to the years of proving herself in a system that hadn't always welcomed her presence. She bought it the day she was appointed to the Superior Court, a reminder that excellence and perseverance could overcome any barrier. As she drove through the city streets, Kimberly noticed the small changes in her community: the new family-owned restaurant that had replaced the abandoned storefront, the recently planted trees along the boulevard, the children's playground she'd helped secure funding for through her community advocacy work. These small victories meant as much to her as any case she presided over. She took the familiar route home, one she'd driven hundreds of times. The evening air was crisp, and she had rolled down her windows slightly to enjoy the spring breeze. Her mind wandered to the upcoming weekend. She was scheduled to speak at a youth leadership program, something she always looked forward to. Sharing her journey with young people, especially those who saw themselves in her story, gave her life additional purpose beyond her role in the courtroom. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on as she turned onto Oak Avenue, a beautiful tree-lined street that always reminded her of her childhood neighborhood. She'd deliberately chosen to live in this diverse community, believing that success didn't mean having to leave your roots behind. Her house was just 10 minutes away, and she was looking forward to changing into comfortable clothes and maybe calling her sister to catch up on family news. The radio played softly in the background, an old soul tune that reminded her of Sunday afternoons in her mother's kitchen. She hummed along, tapping her fingers gently on the steering wheel, completely unaware that her ordinary evening was about to become anything but routine. The last rays of sunlight caught her rearview mirror, temporarily blinding her, and that's when she noticed the flash of blue lights behind her car. Her heart didn't race, not yet. Years of facing challenges had taught her to stay calm in any situation. She checked her speedometer one last time, knowing she'd been driving exactly at the limit. Her turn signals had been used properly, her registration was current, and her driving record was spotless. As she began to pull over to the curb, she took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was, above all else, a representative of the justice system she'd sworn to uphold. Little did she know that this seemingly routine traffic stop would soon become a powerful reminder that even in her position, wearing her judge's robes in the courtroom didn't shield her from the realities that many in her community faced every day. As she reached for her purse to get her license, she quietly resolved to handle whatever came next with the same dignity and strength that had carried her through countless other challenges in her life. The police cruiser's lights painted everything in flashing blue, turning an ordinary evening into something more ominous. Judge Washington switched on her interior light and placed both hands on the steering wheel, a habit she'd learned long ago and had unfortunately needed to use more times than she cared to remember. Her peaceful drive home had suddenly transformed into a familiar scene that made her stomach tighten, despite her years of experience handling tense situations in the courtroom. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer take his time approaching her car. His hand rested near his holster, a detail that didn't escape her notice, despite the growing darkness. She could hear his heavy footsteps on the pavement, deliberately slow, as if he was trying to build tension. The judge took another deep breath, reminding herself that she had nothing to be nervous about. Still, decades of experience had taught her that innocence wasn't always enough. When the beam of the officer's flashlight swept through her car windows, it wasn't just looking for threats, it was making assumptions. The light lingered a bit too long on her designer handbag in the passenger seat, her judicial papers carefully organized in their leather portfolio, the small university alumni pin on her lapel. "Officer Miller," She could now read his nameplate, seemed surprised to find the interior of her Mercedes so immaculate and professional. "License and registration," he barked, not bothering with the customary greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone carried that edge she'd heard before, the one that suggested he already made up his mind about who she was and what she was doing in this neighborhood. Judge Washington kept her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her documents, noting how the officer tensed with each motion. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" she asked, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in her courtroom. The question was simple, professional, and well within her rights. But Officer Miller's response came with a smirk that made her blood run cold. "You made an illegal lane change back there," he claimed, though they both knew she'd done no such thing. "And I couldn't help but notice this vehicle seems a bit out of place in this area." The implication in his words hung heavy in the air between them. The judge felt her jaw tighten, but years of maintaining composure in difficult situations helped her keep her expression neutral. The officer took her documents, holding them in his flashlight's beam. His eyebrows furrowed as he studied her license, then looked back at her face, then at the license again. Something wasn't adding up in his mind. The address on her license matched this upscale neighborhood. Her professional appearance contradicted whatever stereotypes he'd been expecting. "This is your car?" he questioned, his tone making it clear he didn't believe it could be. "Where are you coming from at this hour?" The questions weren't really about gathering information. They were about asserting authority, about making her feel small. But Judge Washington had spent too many years building herself up to be diminished by this encounter. She could feel her pulse quickening, not from fear, but from a deep, familiar frustration. Every carefully earned degree, every case presided over with fairness and wisdom, every barrier broken, none of it protected her from moments like this. But she also knew something the officer didn't. She understood the law better than he ever would, and she was about to teach him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. As she reached for her courthouse identification, tucked neatly behind her driver's license, Judge Washington thought about all the people who'd faced similar situations without her credentials to protect them. This moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about using her position to create change. Officer Miller had no idea that his routine traffic stop was about to become a turning point in his career, and possibly in the department's history. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Miller demanded, his voice carrying that unmistakable tone of authority that brooked no argument. Judge Washington felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, but her face remained calm. She'd seen this scene play out countless times in her courtroom. Officers testifying about traffic stops gone wrong, civilians sharing their stories of mistreatment. Now she was living it. The evening air had grown cooler, and goosebumps rose on her arms as she carefully opened her car door. Her movements were deliberate and measured, just as she'd always advised others to behave in these situations. The weight of her judicial robe, still draped over the back seat, seemed to mock the current situation where her position held no immediate power. "Ma'am, can you explain how you came to be driving this vehicle?" Officer Miller's question dripped with suspicion. The beam of his flashlight swept over her tailored suit, her modest jewelry, her sensible heels, all markers of professional success that seemed to only deepen his doubt. His hand hadn't moved from his holster, a detail that spoke volumes about his preconceptions. Judge Washington stood straight, her full height making her nearly eye level with the officer. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice carrying the same steady authority she used in her courtroom, "I own this vehicle. I purchased it after my appointment to the Superior Court bench. Would you like to see the registration again?" She watched his face carefully, noting how his expression shifted between confusion and disbelief. The sound of another police car approaching filled the air, its lights adding to the blue and red display that had turned this quiet street into an impromptu stage. A backup officer that Officer Miller had apparently called was arriving, standard procedure for what he must have deemed a suspicious situation. The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on her. 2 police officers, 2 patrol cars, all for a respected judge driving home from work. "The registration shows a Kimberly Washington," Officer Miller said, shining his light on the papers again. "Is that supposed to be you?" The emphasis he placed on supposed made her blood simmer, but years of judicial training had taught her to channel anger into action. She reached into her purse, slowly, noting how both officers tensed, and pulled out her court identification. The gold judicial badge caught the strobing lights of the police cars, creating small flashes of brilliance in the growing darkness. "Yes, officer. I am Judge Kimberly Washington of the Superior Court, 3rd District." She held out her credentials, watching as Officer Miller's face transformed from skepticism to shock to something approaching fear. The backup officer stepped forward, immediately recognizing her. "Judge Washington, I testified in your courtroom last month on the Henderson case." His voice carried a note of recognition and respect that had been notably absent from his colleague's approach. The dynamic of the situation shifted dramatically, like a sudden change in air pressure before a storm. Officer Miller's hand finally dropped from his holster, but the damage was already done. Every moment of this stop, from the initial profile to the escalation, had been recorded by both patrol cars' dash cameras and body cameras. Judge Washington knew this footage would tell a story that no amount of police report creativity could obscure. "Officers," she said, her voice now carrying all the weight of her position, "I believe we've established that I am who I say I am, and this vehicle is, indeed, mine. However, I'm very interested in understanding what probable cause led to this traffic stop." The question hung in the air like smoke, making both officers shift uncomfortably. The backup officer looked at his colleague, then back at the judge, clearly realizing they had stumbled into a situation that would have repercussions far beyond this evening. Judge Washington stood patiently, her mere presence now commanding the scene. She wasn't just a driver being harassed anymore. She was the embodiment of the justice system itself, watching its flaws play out in real time. The silence that followed Judge Washington's question seemed to stretch for an eternity. Officer Miller stared at her judicial credentials as if they might somehow change under his flashlight's beam. His whole demeanor had shifted. Gone was the aggressive authority, replaced by an uncomfortable realization that he had severely misjudged the situation. Officer Miller stammered, clearly struggling to maintain his professional composure. His colleague, the backup officer, took a small step backward, already understanding the gravity of what was unfolding. The night air felt heavy with tension, broken only by the steady pulse of the patrol car's emergency lights that continued to paint the scene in alternating red and blue. Judge Washington could have unleashed her fury right then. She could have reminded him of every case she'd presided over where officers like him had demonstrated similar behavior. She could have mentioned the countless times she'd heard testimony about routine traffic stops that were anything but routine. Instead, she chose her next words carefully, thinking about the impact they would have. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used when delivering verdicts. "In my courtroom, I've seen many cases where officers have had to explain their reasons for initiating a traffic stop. I'm curious, how would you explain this one under oath?" The question wasn't just about this moment, it was about every similar stop that had happened before. The backup officer cleared his throat nervously. "Judge Washington, I apologize for this inconvenience. Perhaps we could," but she raised her hand slightly, the same gesture she used to quiet her courtroom, and he fell silent immediately. This moment wasn't about accepting a hasty apology, it was about confronting an uncomfortable truth. Officer Miller's face had turned a shade paler under the streetlights. The credentials in his hands suddenly felt as heavy as the responsibility he bore as a law enforcement officer. "Your Honor, I observed what I believed to be an illegal lane change," he attempted to explain, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. "Did you?" she asked, gesturing to the dash cameras on both patrol cars. "I look forward to reviewing that footage." Her words weren't a threat, they were a promise. In that moment, she wasn't just a judge watching over her courtroom, she was justice itself, standing on a dark street corner, demanding accountability. The night had grown cooler, but nobody moved. Judge Washington's Mercedes sat silently behind them, its expensive silhouette a reminder of the assumptions that had led to this confrontation. A few curious neighbors had appeared on their porches, drawn by the unusual spectacle of police lights in their quiet neighborhood. "Your Honor," Officer Miller finally managed, his voice notably more respectful, "you're free to go. I apologize for taking up your evening." But Judge Washington didn't move. She stood there, elegant and composed, a living reminder of the position he had put himself in. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice now carrying a hint of the educator she always strived to be. "I want you to understand something. Tonight you pulled over a judge, and that revealed certain biases in your approach to law enforcement. But what troubles me more is thinking about how this situation might have played out if I had been anyone else, a teacher, a nurse, a student." The weight of her words settled over the scene like a heavy blanket. Both officers shifted uncomfortably, understanding that this wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. It was about systemic issues that couldn't be ignored any longer. The backup officer's body camera recorded every word, every gesture, creating an undeniable record of this encounter. Judge Washington reached for her car door, her movements still deliberately calm and measured. "I expect to see both of you in my chambers tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., she said, not as a suggestion but as a directive. "We'll discuss this incident in detail and, more importantly, what we're going to do about it." Her words carried the promise of change, not just punishment. Back in her car, Judge Washington's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. The blue and red lights finally faded from her rearview mirror, but the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on her shoulders. She took several deep breaths, just as she'd learned to do during her early days on the bench when difficult cases threatened to overwhelm her emotions. The remaining drive home was a blur of streetlights and familiar turns, a mind already working through the steps she would need to take. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about using her position to create meaningful change. As she pulled into her driveway, the security light welcomed her home, but sleep would have to wait. Inside her home office, she sat at her desk, her judicial robe now hanging on its usual hook behind her door. The room's warm lighting and familiar surroundings helped calm her racing thoughts. She opened her laptop and began documenting everything while it was still fresh in her mind. Every word, every gesture, every subtle indication of bias she'd observed during the stop. Her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, recording Officer Miller's initial aggressive approach, his hand placement near his weapon, his tone of voice, and the exact words he'd used. Years of writing judicial opinions had taught her the importance of being thorough and precise. Each detail mattered, each moment needed to be preserved with crystal clarity. As she typed, she remembered the faces of countless individuals who had appeared before her, sharing similar stories of profiling and prejudice. How many times had she listened to these accounts from her elevated bench, maintaining judicial neutrality while inwardly understanding exactly what they had experienced? Tonight, she had lived their truth. The clock on her wall ticked steadily as she worked, reminding her of the late hour. But this couldn't wait until morning. She pulled up the police department's internal affairs documentation requirements, making sure her report would meet every procedural standard. There could be no procedural loopholes, no technical oversights that might undermine what needed to be done. She paused briefly, reaching for her phone to send a message to her court clerk about adjusting tomorrow's morning docket. The meeting she demanded with the officers would need proper time. This wasn't something to be rushed. Her calendar could wait, this couldn't. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of her laptop and the occasional rustle of papers as she referenced her notes. She thought about Officer Miller's face when he realized who she was, not because her position should have mattered, but because it revealed so clearly how differently he might have treated someone without her credentials. Her report grew longer as she included broader context, statistics about traffic stops in the district, patterns she'd observed from her bench, relevant case law about probable cause and police discretion. This wasn't just going to be a complaint, it would be a catalyst for departmental review and, hopefully, real change. As she neared the end of her documentation, she reached for her phone again, this time to call the police chief directly. It was late, but she knew he would want to hear about this incident from her first. Their professional relationship had always been built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to justice. Tonight, that relationship would be tested. Judge Washington sat back in her chair, reviewing what she had written. Every word was measured, every accusation supported by specific facts. There was no angry rhetoric, no emotional accusations, just a clear, professional account of an incident that should never have happened. Her response would set the tone for everything that followed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the meeting with the officers, discussions with the police chief, possible media attention. But tonight, she had done what she did best. Documented the truth, prepared the groundwork for justice, and maintained the professional dignity her position demanded. The system that had failed tonight would face its own judgment in the morning. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows as Judge Washington settled into her chambers. She had arrived earlier than usual, her detailed report from the previous night printed and organized in a crisp folder on her desk. The familiar sounds of the courthouse coming to life filtered through her door, shuffling papers, distant conversations, the gentle hum of activity that usually brought her comfort. Her first action was to call the Internal Affairs Division. The lieutenant who answered recognized her voice immediately, and the usual friendly exchange was replaced by a tone of serious professionalism when she mentioned the reason for her call. "Your Honor, I understand the sensitivity of this matter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "We'll need to get your statement in person." Within an hour, 2 internal affairs investigators sat across from her, their badges gleaming under the office lights. They weren't from the same precinct as Officer Miller, a detail she appreciated. Her report lay between them, its pages filled with the previous night's events in careful detail. As she spoke, one investigator took notes while the other recorded her statement. "I want to be clear," Judge Washington said, her voice steady and measured. "This isn't about retribution. This is about addressing a systemic issue that I've seen far too often from my bench." She walked them through every moment of the traffic stop, from the initial flashing lights to the final confrontation. Her words painted a vivid picture of bias in action, one that couldn't be easily dismissed. The investigators paid special attention when she mentioned the dash cam footage. "We'll need to secure that immediately," the senior investigator said, already reaching for his phone. They all knew how crucial that evidence would be, how it would either support or challenge Officer Miller's eventual account of the incident. As she described the officer's behavior, Judge Washington remembered every similar case she'd heard in her courtroom. "I've seen this pattern before," she explained, pulling out statistics she'd gathered over the years. "The difference is, most people who experience this don't have the platform I do to address it." The meeting stretched on as the investigators asked detailed questions about timing, exact phrases used, and specific actions taken. Judge Washington answered each query with judicial precision, neither embellishing nor minimizing what had occurred. Her years on the bench had taught her the value of exact truth. When they discussed Officer Miller's backup arriving at the scene, she noted how the dynamic had shifted. "It was telling," she observed, "how quickly the situation changed once my position was known. That transformation speaks volumes about the underlying issues we need to address." The investigators exchanged glances when she mentioned her scheduled meeting with the officers later that morning. "Your Honor," the senior investigator began carefully, "we typically prefer to handle these interviews ourselves." But Judge Washington held up her hand, a gesture familiar to anyone who'd been in her courtroom. "This meeting isn't part of your investigation," she explained. "It's about something more fundamental. These officers need to understand the impact of their actions from someone who's seen both sides of our justice system." Her tone made it clear this wasn't up for discussion. As the investigators gathered their materials, Judge Washington handed them one final document, a sealed envelope containing her formal recommendations for departmental reform. "This goes beyond one traffic stop," she said. "We have an opportunity here to create real change." The morning light had grown stronger, casting long shadows across her desk as the investigators left. Through her window, she could see the city spreading out below, the community she'd sworn to serve and protect through her position. Today, she was keeping that promise in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her court clerk poked her head in, reminding her that Officer Miller and his colleague would arrive soon. Judge Washington nodded, straightening the papers on her desk. She wasn't just preparing for a meeting, she was preparing to turn an incident of injustice into a moment of transformation. The wheels of justice turned swiftly over the next few weeks. Internal Affairs didn't just investigate the single traffic stop, they dug deeper, pulling records of every stop Officer Miller had made in the past 3 years. The data painted a picture that couldn't be ignored, spread across the conference room table in neat stacks of paper and colorful graphs. The police chief sat at the head of the table, his face growing more serious with each page he turned. The numbers told the story that made his stomach turn. African-American drivers were being pulled over at a rate nearly 5 times higher than other drivers in Officer Miller's patrol area. The reasonable suspicions cited in his reports followed a troubling pattern. "Look at these timestamps," one investigator pointed out, spreading several reports across the table. Multiple stops, same location, similar descriptions of probable cause, but vastly different outcomes based on the driver's background. The evidence was mounting, turning Judge Washington's incident from a single event into the tip of a much larger iceberg. Body camera footage from dozens of stops played on the screen mounted on the wall. The differences in Officer Miller's approach were stark. His tone, his hand placement, his choice of words shifting dramatically based on who sat behind the wheel. The backup officer from that night sat through the review, his own footage now part of the growing evidence pile. The department's data analyst had worked overtime, creating detailed maps showing the patterns of Miller's patrol routes and stops. Hot spots emerged in certain neighborhoods, while other areas showed barely any activity. Each dot on the map represented someone's story, someone's encounter with law enforcement colored by preconceptions and bias. In the break room, officers who'd worked alongside Miller for years struggled to reconcile these findings with the colleague they thought they knew. Some defended him, pointing to his arrest record and commendations. Others sat in silence, perhaps remembering moments they'd witnessed but failed to address. The investigation expanded beyond just Officer Miller. His supervisors were called in to explain how these patterns had gone unnoticed or unaddressed. Performance reviews were scrutinized, citizen complaints re-examined. The ripple effect touched every corner of the department. Training records revealed gaps in bias awareness education. While officers had received the mandatory minimum training, there had been no follow-up, no real-world application of the principles they'd been taught. The department's cultural competency expert, long ignored, finally had an audience for her concerns. Body language experts analyzed the footage from Judge Washington's stop, breaking down every movement, every tone shift, every subtle indication of predetermined judgment. Their report became required reading for the entire force, a case study in how implicit bias manifests in routine interactions. The backup officer's testimony proved crucial. His statement detailed not just that night, but other incidents he'd witnessed, times when he'd felt uncomfortable but hadn't spoken up. His honesty opened the door for other officers to come forward, creating a clearer picture of departmental culture. Social media posts and private messages between officers were reviewed, revealing casual conversations that highlighted deeper issues. The investigation wasn't just about one officer anymore, it was about systems, culture, and the unwritten rules that had allowed these behaviors to flourish. In Judge Washington's courtroom, cases involving traffic stops were getting extra scrutiny. Defense attorneys cited her experience, questioning probable cause with renewed vigor. The incident had sparked a quiet revolution in how these cases were being handled throughout the district. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the evidence filled multiple boxes. Patterns emerged that couldn't be explained away, statistics that couldn't be justified, and stories that couldn't be ignored. The department faced a choice: acknowledge the deeply rooted issues and commit to real change, or risk losing the community's trust entirely. The final report sat on the police chief's desk, its recommendations highlighted in yellow. Beyond individual accountability, it called for systemic changes, from hiring practices to promotion criteria, from patrol assignments to community engagement. What had started as one traffic stop was about to transform an entire department. The police department's press conference room was packed with reporters, their cameras and microphones pointed at the podium where the chief of police stood. Behind him, a large screen displayed the department's new initiatives, but all eyes were focused on his grim expression as he prepared to address the findings of the investigation. "Today marks a turning point for our department," the chief began, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility. "The recent investigation has revealed patterns of behavior that are unacceptable and inconsistent with our mission to protect and serve all members of our community." The room fell silent as he detailed the changes that would follow. Officer Miller sat in the back row, out of uniform, his face a mask of contemplation. The past month had been a journey of uncomfortable revelations. His 2-week suspension had given him time to reflect on every traffic stop, every snap judgment, every moment where bias had clouded his professional judgment. The mandatory retraining program wasn't just another box to check. This time, it was different. The department had brought in experts in cultural awareness, civil rights attorneys, and community leaders. Officers weren't just sitting through lectures, they were having real conversations about race, privilege, and the power they held as law enforcement officials. Local media had picked up the story, not just of Judge Washington's stop, but of the broader implications revealed by the investigation. Headlines spoke of systemic change and department-wide reform. Editorial pages filled with letters from community members sharing similar experiences, finally feeling heard. The police union initially pushed back against some of the proposed changes, but even they couldn't ignore the overwhelming evidence. When body camera footage from multiple stops was made public, the union's position shifted from defense to collaboration, recognizing that change was necessary for the department's survival. In roll call rooms across the city, officers engaged in frank discussions about what they'd seen and heard. The backup officer from that night became an unexpected voice for change, sharing how witnessing Judge Washington's stop had opened his eyes to behaviors he previously normalized. The department's new oversight committee included community members, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement veterans. They would review traffic stop data monthly, looking for patterns that might indicate bias. No longer would these statistics gather dust in forgotten databases, they would drive real-time adjustments in patrol strategies and officer assignments. Training procedures were completely overhauled. New officers would spend time in the communities they would serve, not just patrolling but participating in community events, meeting residents, and understanding the neighborhoods from a different perspective. Veteran officers would be required to complete regular cultural competency updates. The chief announced a zero-tolerance policy for biased policing, backed by a new early warning system that would flag concerning patterns before they became entrenched behaviors. Officers would be evaluated not just on their arrest records, but on their community engagement and their ability to de-escalate situations. Body cameras became mandatory for all interactions, not just emergency calls. The footage would be regularly reviewed, not to catch officers doing something wrong, but to identify and promote best practices in community policing. Officers who demonstrated exceptional fairness and professionalism would be recognized and rewarded. For Officer Miller, the consequences extended beyond the suspension and retraining. He requested a transfer to community outreach, where he would work directly with neighborhood groups to rebuild trust. His experience would become a teaching tool for other officers, a real-world example of how unconscious bias could impact law enforcement. The department's website now featured a transparent complaint process, making it easier for citizens to report concerns. But more importantly, it highlighted positive interactions between officers and community members, showing that change was possible and already happening. As the press conference concluded, reporters rushed to file their stories, but the real story was in the quiet conversations happening throughout the department. Officers discussed how these changes would affect their daily work, sharing concerns and hopes for the future. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary and long overdue. 6 months later, Judge Washington stood at the podium in the Police Academy's graduation hall. The room was filled with fresh-faced recruits, their badges newly pinned and gleaming under the lights. Their families sat in the audience, proud smiles and camera flashes punctuating the atmosphere of hope and possibility. When I was pulled over that night, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. I didn't know it would lead to this moment. But sometimes, the most significant changes come from our most challenging experiences. The room fell silent, every ear tuned to her words, every eye fixed on her commanding presence. In the front row, Officer Miller sat in his new community liaison uniform. His face showed the journey of the past months, the hard conversations, the honest self-reflection, the gradual understanding that had transformed him from a symbol of the problem into an advocate for change. He now led workshops on bias awareness, sharing his story with a humility that made his message powerful. The recruits listened as Judge Washington described the ripple effects of that traffic stop. Crime rates hadn't increased with the new policies. They'd actually decreased in many areas as community trust grew stronger. Traffic stops were down, but meaningful arrests were up. Officers were solving more crimes because people were more willing to talk to them, to trust them, to work with them. She shared stories of positive changes, The elderly woman who now waved to patrol cars instead of hurrying inside, the teenage boys who joined the police athletic league instead of avoiding officers, the community meetings where real dialogue had replaced mutual suspicion. These weren't just feel-good anecdotes, they were signs of a department transformed. The new training procedures she'd helped develop were already showing results. Recruits spent time in different neighborhoods, not as authorities but as learners, understanding the communities they would serve. They attended cultural events, played in community sports leagues, and built relationships before they ever put on a uniform. In the audience, community leaders nodded as she spoke about the Oversight Committee's success. Regular reviews of traffic stop data had revealed and addressed potential issues before they became problems. Officers who showed exceptional fairness and community engagement were being promoted, creating a new model of leadership. The police chief's vision of a transformed department was becoming reality. Monthly community forums had evolved from tense confrontations into productive partnerships. Citizens and officers worked together on neighborhood improvement projects, their shared efforts building bridges that decades of mistrust had destroyed. Judge Washington looked at the young faces before her, seeing in them the future of law enforcement. "Your badge is not just a symbol of authority," she told them. "It's a commitment to justice, to fairness, to seeing the humanity in every person you encounter." The recruits sat straighter, feeling the weight of her words. She spoke about the power they would hold, the power to make split-second decisions that could change lives forever. But more importantly, she spoke about their power to build trust, to heal wounds, to be the officers their communities needed them to be. The room was silent as her words sank in. Looking out over the audience, she could see some of her regular courthouse faces, public defenders, prosecutors, and fellow judges who had watched this transformation unfold. They had all seen the changes in their daily work: fewer contested traffic stops, more community cooperation, a growing sense that justice could work for everyone. As she concluded her speech, Judge Washington shared one final thought. That night could have ended with just another complaint filed and forgotten. Instead, it became a catalyst for real change. Remember that every interaction you have, every decision you make, carries that same potential. You're not just enforcing laws, you're building the foundation of trust that makes true justice possible. The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was thunderous, filled with hope and commitment. As she stepped away from the podium, Judge Washington knew that while one traffic stop had started this journey, it was the collective will to change that would ensure its lasting impact. The real work would continue, day by day, officer by officer, community by community, building a future where justice truly served all.